thanks for giving me the opportunity to practice my panel in class today. The essay that I wrote was for a class called Problems in Hellenistic History. Briefly, this course gives us a unique perspective on history because the majority of sources that we use are not from ancient scholars, but papyri documents written by ordinary people that have been preserved in the dry Egyptian climate. The title of my essay is Ethnicity and Discrimination in Ptolemaic Egypt. The question that I try to answer in my essay is, did racism limit Egyptians' opportunities in public life? First, I'm going to give a brief background of the world that I'm taking you. Then I'll present the opinions of two modern scholars that my seminar has intensely studied. Then I'll argue my opinions, and finally I'll open the floor to questions and comments. So first, Hellenistic history is a study of a particular locale in a certain period of time that has been predominantly influenced by Greek culture. Ptolemaic Egypt was 3 centuries of Greek rule in Egypt from 323 BC to 30 BC. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great liberated Egypt from the Persian overlords who dominated the country for nearly a century. When Alexander was on his deathbed, he was asked who would be the heir to his vast empire. He said, "The strongest." Upon his death, his generals fought amongst themselves and carved up the empire into autonomous factions. Ptolemy won Egypt, thus establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was a succession of incest, where sons married mothers, sisters, or even both at the same time. I'm going to tell you very briefly the events leading up to and the consequences of Alexander's great conquest. Greece was a conglomeration of independent city-states, identifiable only by common language and religion. In the first half of the 5th century BC, there were 2 Persian invasions of mainland Greece. Athens became the head of an alliance of Greek cities who paid Athens to build a fleet of ships to combat the Persians. The Greeks were victorious. For the sake of security, Athens wanted its allies to continue to pay this tribute. Some city-states, also called polis, wanted to leave the alliance and no longer pay. Athens went to extreme measures to keep them from doing so. As a result, the Greek polis who wanted out appealed to Sparta to lead them in a war against the Athenian Empire. This was known as the Peloponnesian War, which took place in the second half of the 5th century BC. The war was extremely destructive. The farms in the countryside were devastated. The war ended with the surrender of Athens and the dissolution of the empire. This gave the unscathed Macedonians to the north the opportunity to conquer mainland Greece. This was the base from where Alexander launched his conquest, which went as far as India. This opened a whole world for Greeks, searching for a new life in rich and cultured areas of the world. Alexander wanted to Hellenize his empire. He married a Persian, got 40 of his military elite to do the same, and encouraged intermarriage between the Greeks and the natives. The aftermath of the Peloponnesian War left little options for mainland Greeks. Many found employment as mercenaries and sold their services to the generals who succeeded Alexander, such as Ptolemy. Other Greeks would move to one of the many Greek polis founded by Alexander, such as Alexandria and Egypt. So to answer my question, did racism limit Egyptians' opportunity in public life? It's a difficult task, and you need to understand the circumstances in Ptolemaic Egypt, or that the circumstances in Ptolemaic Egypt were vastly different, depending on the time period and the region being examined. It is insufficient to give this question a yes or no answer without the proper focus. So my answer is no. Ptolemaic society was one that provided equal opportunity for all, based on merit, rather than a society that propagated racial discrimination. I feel a little uncomfortable trying to explain my answer to you in my 10 minutes or so remaining because, as I just mentioned, circumstances vary greatly depending on time and place. Any one of these variances could independently convince you that there was racial discrimination. However, by looking at it all in context, I may convince you yet that I make a valid argument. Before I get into the opinions of the 2 modern scholars, I'll finish setting up the background with the anthropological organization of Egypt that remained essentially unchanged throughout the Greek occupation. But first, I want you to keep in mind that my focus on public life refers to the administration and the military. It becomes increasingly difficult to argue my case for the higher positions in both areas where there are less offices, and it seems they are reserved only for Greeks. There are 3 autonomous Greek polis in Egypt. They are organized and function in the traditional Greek way. Citizenship was carefully protected by strict rules that prohibited any illegitimate child from obtaining it. This included the offspring of a Greek who intermarried with an Egyptian. Citizenship was reserved for only one polis, It wasn't an open membership to all of them. A citizen had access to the gymnasium, which was the educational and cultural heart of the polis. Citizens were the only ones who could participate in the administrative functions of their polis. Moving on. The rest of the country had traditionally been divided into different provinces called nomes. Each nome had its own administrative hierarchy. Beyond a certain level, the top officials held office in the capital city of Alexandria, where the Ptolemaic kings and queens ruled. This system was maintained by the Ptolemies. The official administrative language became Greek. There was a Greek court that settled judicial matters and criminal petitions, called the kremastiste, but the native Egyptian court, called the laiokrite, was used everywhere outside the polis. Because the Greek kremastiste had a habit of encroaching on the jurisdiction of the laiokrite, after 188 BC, the court that was used depended on the language the document was written in. So the Egyptian language, called Demotic, was not made obsolete and used by the majority of the population. I'm going to set up the background about the military, and this is where my topic gets sticky. At the beginning of the dynasty, the Ptolemies hired Greek mercenaries instead of arming and training the Egyptians. The Greek mercenaries came from all over, but they were not citizens of any of the Egyptian polis. They would billet in half of an Egyptian's house, which caused racial tensions. The mercenaries also posed a threat to the throne because they had no loyalty to the crown, and there was a risk of armed upheaval if they didn't get paid. Needless to say, they were a burden on the royal treasury. The king owned vast tracts of royal land and offered the mercenaries an option to settle a plot of land in exchange for their military service whenever it was required. Many of these Greeks agreed and rented out the land to Egyptians to work on as they moved into the cities, now free to find administrative work. And I want you guys to keep in mind that because of my time limits, I'm drastically simplifying this background. And for simplicity's sake, I'm going to call any place beyond the confines of the polis the Kora, which you can consider to be the Egyptian countryside or village. Greeks permanently residing in the Kora had no need for citizenship, and many intermarried with the native population. If we give it a couple of generations, we can understand that you no longer have an easily identifiable pure-blood Greek or Egyptian, but rather a hybrid of the two. This is why I said this is what makes my topic sticky. Keep in mind two things. First, how can racial discrimination be applied when ethnic distinctions can hardly be made? Second, Greek status in the Kora is passed on to the native spouses and the subsequent generations as far as it can be traced. This creates a plethora of situations and a call for a system to classify these individuals. At this point, I will discuss two sources before I move on to the opinions of the modern scholars. The first is an archive from the 2nd century BC about a man named Driton. He was a citizen of a Greek polis. He married another Greek citizen from the same polis, and they bore a son who inherited that citizenship. Driton was a cavalry officer. He divorced his wife and moved to garrison a city that was predominantly populated by Egyptians. There he met his new wife, Apollonia, whose family all had dual Greek and Egyptian names. Apollonia was born Egyptian, but considered herself to be a Greek because her father fought in the army. And at this point, I must digress for a moment to explain that in the late 3rd century, there was a battle for which Ptolemy IV used Egyptian soldiers, thus establishing a precedent which allowed them to participate in the military. The military units were organized based on polis or ancestral origin. For example, Driton was in the Cretan unit, and Apollonia's father was in the Cyrenian unit. If there were not enough soldiers from a certain polis, or if the soldier was an Egyptian, he would be placed in an existing unit and claim that to be his ancestral place of origin. There's a lot to absorb. So now, back to my earlier point. The daughters of Driton and Apollonia were not given citizenship. They had dual Greek and Egyptian names, but used their Egyptian names on tax records and wrote in Demotic. This is but one type of many examples that shows how assimilated the people in the Kora had become, to the point where their ethnicity is hardly distinguishable. The second source I wanted to discuss is a document dated to the late 3rd century BC, which is a set of regulations of how an individual identified him or herself on a contract. In a nutshell, the person must state their name, their father's name, and their ancestral place of origin. There's more factors to that, but trying to be succinct here. So now that I've superficially set the stage, I will give you two perspectives on how the Egyptians were systematic